I knew something was wrong before I even saw it. You ever have one of those moments where your gut figures it out a few seconds before your brain catches up? That's exactly what happened to me. Saturday morning, little after 8, coffee in my hand, neighborhood quiet except for the usual birds making a racket in the trees. Everything felt normal until I heard metal clanging somewhere behind my house. Then came the sound of wood being dropped, followed by the low murmur of men talking. I remember stepping off my back porch and stopping halfway down the stairs. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking into the wrong yard, because in the far corner of my property, there was a structure, not a pile of lumber, not building materials waiting to be used. A structure. Posts were already set. Framing was up. Fresh concrete glistened in the sunlight. And standing right in the middle of it like he owned the place was my neighbor. His name was Randall Mercer. Now, Randall wasn't officially part of the HOA board, but you'd never know it from the way he acted. He was one of those guys who corrected everybody. If your trash can sat outside an extra hour, he'd mention it. If your lawn grew a quarter-inch too high, somehow he'd notice. He always walked around with this attitude that the neighborhood was his personal kingdom and the rest of us were just renting space inside it. The thing is, I'd spent 3 years living next to him without any major problems. Annoyances? Sure. Arguments? Not really. I mostly kept to myself. Apparently, that was my first mistake. Randall looked up and saw me staring. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a nervous smile. The kind of smile someone gives when they've already decided they're getting away with something. "Morning, Nate," he called out. I didn't answer. My eyes had already drifted to the ground, because the corner where they were building wasn't just some random patch of dirt. That was where my grandmother's hydrangea bush had been. 10 years earlier, she planted it herself during the last summer she was healthy enough to garden. Every spring those flowers came back. Big blue blooms that somehow survived storms, droughts, freezing winters, and every dumb mistake I'd made trying to care for them after she passed away. Now there was nothing, just broken roots mixed into wet concrete. I felt my stomach drop, not because of the plant itself, because of what it represented. Some people keep photo albums. Some keep jewelry. That bush was one of the last living things connected to her, and it had just been buried. I finally looked at Randall again. "What exactly are you doing?" The workers stopped moving. Randall didn't. He just shoved his hands into his pockets and glanced toward the structure. "Building a storage shed. In my yard." He laughed. Actually laughed. "It's barely over the property line." I stared at him. Barely. Like that somehow made it okay. Then I looked down and spotted something that made my pulse jump. The survey marker. The original metal property stake was still there, half visible beneath the edge of the freshly poured concrete. The line wasn't unclear. The line wasn't disputed. The line was literally marked. I pointed at it. "Everything past that marker belongs to me." For a second, I thought maybe he'd at least pretend to check. Maybe act surprised. Maybe claim he didn't know. Instead, he barely glanced in that direction. "It's already built, Nate." Not being built. Built. Like the conversation was over. Like the decision had already been made. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was a choice. A calculated one. The workers went back to hammering. Randall turned away, and I just stood there listening to the sound of nails driving deeper into my property. My hand was shaking around the coffee cup. Not from anger. At least not entirely. It was disbelief. The kind that hits when reality suddenly stops making sense. Because I kept asking myself the same question. How did he think this was going to end? I could have started yelling. A lot of people would have. Honestly, part of me wanted to. Instead, I turned around, walked back inside, set my coffee on the kitchen counter, and grabbed a notepad. Then I wrote down one thing. Saturday, 8:17 a.m. Because something deep down told me this wasn't going to be solved with a conversation. And if Randall Mercer thought I was the kind of neighbor who would quietly let this go, he was about to find out how wrong he was. The funny thing about people like Randall is they rarely wake up one morning and decide to do something reckless. Most of the time, they've been getting away with small things for years, little boundary pushes, little tests, little moments where nobody pushes back. Looking back, I could suddenly see all of them. The times his truck tires crossed onto my driveway. The way he'd blow leaves from his yard into mine and somehow act offended if I mentioned it. The endless comments about what I should do with my property. None of it seemed important at the time. Separately, they were just annoyances. Together, they painted a picture. Randall had spent years convincing himself that everyone around him would eventually bend. This time he picked the wrong person. I didn't confront him again. That surprised him. I know it did, because over the next several days, I caught him watching me. Every time I walked outside, every time I pulled into the driveway, every time I checked the mail. It was almost like he was waiting for an argument, waiting for a scene, waiting for me to become emotional enough to make a mistake. Instead, I did something much more frustrating. I documented everything. Every morning before work, I took pictures. Every evening after work, I took more. I photographed the concrete, the framing, the measurements, the location of the survey stake, the workers, the progress. Day after day, the shed grew larger. Walls went up. Roof panels appeared. Paint followed. By the end of the week, it looked like it had been sitting there for years. And that's when I started understanding the psychology behind what Randall had done. The speed wasn't accidental. People think construction is about building. Sometimes it's about pressure. The faster something gets finished, the harder it feels to challenge. A foundation becomes a wall. A wall becomes a roof. A roof becomes a completed structure. And suddenly people start thinking, well, maybe I should just let it go. Maybe it's not worth the fight. Maybe the damage is already done. I had a feeling Randall was counting on exactly that. What he didn't know was that Monday morning after the shed was completed, I made a phone call. Two, actually. The first was to a licensed surveyor. The second was to an attorney friend I'd gone to college with years ago. His name was Greg. We weren't best friends anymore, but we still talked occasionally. When I explained the situation, there was silence on the other end of the phone for about 3 seconds. Then Greg laughed. Not because it was funny, because he couldn't believe someone would be dumb enough to do it. Tell me he didn't pour concrete over the survey marker. He did. Another pause. Please tell me you took pictures. I took a lot of pictures. Good, he said. Keep taking them. The surveyor arrived 2 days later. His name was Dennis. Gray beard, sunburned neck, looked like he'd spent the last 30 years settling arguments exactly like this one. He walked the property quietly, checked the original markers, compared them with county records, measured twice, measured again. Then he looked over at the shed. Well, he said, I waited. That's not good. How bad? Dennis pointed at the foundation. 22 inches. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because somehow hearing the number made the whole thing even more ridiculous. 22 inches. Not one. Not two. Nearly 2 feet. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a measurement error. That was a decision. Dennis completed the report, stamped it, signed it, and handed me copies before leaving. The moment his truck disappeared down the street, I drove straight to the county office. Now here's something most people don't realize. A lot of conflicts never reach the point where the law gets involved because one side backs down first. The moment official paperwork appears, reality suddenly enters the room. And reality has a way of ruining arrogance. The clerk reviewed the survey, reviewed the photos, reviewed the property records. Then she looked at me. Did your neighbor pull permits? No. She typed something into her computer. Then she smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile people make when they've already seen how the story ends. That may become important. For the next week and a half, nothing happened. At least on the surface. Randall acted exactly the same. Maybe even more confident. Every evening, I'd see him stacking firewood next to the shed, opening and closing the doors, showing it off whenever neighbors walked by. One afternoon, I overheard him talking to another guy across the street. Best decision I ever made, he said. I almost laughed. The paperwork was already moving through the system. He just didn't know it yet. Then came Thursday, about 10 days after filing. I was sitting at my kitchen table paying bills when I noticed a county vehicle pull into Randall's driveway. 2 inspectors stepped out. They spent maybe 15 minutes walking around the structure, taking photographs, measuring, writing notes. Randall followed them the entire time. At first, he looked relaxed, then confused, then irritated. By the time they left, he looked worried, really worried. That evening, I got my answer. A hard knock hit my front door right around sunset. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Randall was standing there. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't look confident. No esmirk, no swagger, no superiority, just tension. "You got a minute?" he asked. I leaned against the doorframe. "Sure." He rubbed the back of his neck, the way people do when they're trying to pretend they're calm. "So, apparently the county's involved." I said nothing. "They sent me a notice." Still nothing. He shifted his weight. "It seems like somebody filed a complaint." There it was. The fishing expedition. Trying to see if I'd admit it. I took a sip from the glass in my hand. "Sounds serious." His jaw tightened. "Come on, Nate." I shrugged. "What does the notice say?" For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. Then he pulled folded papers from his pocket. "Violation of setback requirements. Unauthorized construction. Encroachment onto adjacent property. Failure to obtain required permits. 15 days to remove the structure. At owner's expense." I already knew every word before he read them, but hearing him say them out loud was still satisfying. "Seems pretty clear," I said. His face reddened immediately. "You went to the county." I looked him straight in the eye. "You built a shed on my property. It's 22 inches. Exactly." He threw his hands up. 22 inches, Nate. That's nothing." I nodded slowly, then pointed toward his house. "If it's nothing, move it 22 inches. That landed harder than I expected. For a second, he had no response. No comeback. No clever remark. Just silence. Then the frustration appeared. "You're really doing this?" I couldn't help it. I laughed. Actually laughed. Because after everything he'd done, after destroying my grandmother's hydrangea bush, after pouring concrete across my property line, after ignoring every opportunity to fix it himself, somehow I was the unreasonable one. "Randall," I said quietly, "you started doing this the moment you poured that foundation." His eyes narrowed. The conversation was over. We both knew it. He folded the notice back up, turned around, and walked toward the street. Halfway down the driveway, he stopped. Then he looked back, and what he said next explained everything. Every assumption, every decision, every ounce of entitlement. "You know," he said, "people around here think you're weak because you never stand up for yourself." Then he walked away. I stood there watching him disappear across his lawn. And for the first time since this started, I understood exactly why he'd built that shed. It wasn't about storage space. It wasn't about firewood. It wasn't even about land. Randall had convinced himself that being quiet meant being weak. And now he was about to learn the difference. What neither of us knew that night was that the 15-day deadline would come and go, and Randall Mercer was about to make the single most expensive decision of his life. The 15 days came and went. Nothing moved. Not a board. Not a nail. Not a single piece of that shed. Part of me honestly expected Randall to come to his senses at the last minute. Maybe hire a crew. Maybe take part of it down. Maybe try to work out some kind of compromise before things got worse. Instead, he doubled down. And if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that pride can get expensive faster than almost anything else. Day 16 arrived on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was making breakfast when I heard a diesel engine outside. I glanced through the kitchen window and immediately saw the county flatbed truck pulling onto our street. No flashing lights. No drama. No grand announcement. Just a truck doing a job. 2 workers stepped out carrying clipboards. A third followed behind them with tools. Professional, calm, efficient, the kind of people who weren't there to debate. They were there to finish something. By the time I stepped outside, Randall was already standing in his backyard, arms crossed, jaw clenched, watching. The workers approached him first. A short conversation followed. I couldn't hear most of it. Didn't need to. The expressions said enough. Randall talked. The workers listened. Then one of them pointed toward the paperwork. That ended the discussion. A few minutes later, the dismantling started. And honestly, it was almost boring, which somehow made it even more powerful. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no movie-style meltdown, just consequences. The roof came off first, panel by panel, then sections of the walls, then support beams. Everything methodical, everything documented, everything legal. The same way the structure had gone up quickly, it now came apart piece by piece. Neighbors started appearing. One woman walked her dog past 3 times. A retired couple stood across the street, pretending to check their mailbox for nearly 20 minutes. Even a teenager who usually blasted music while mowing lawns parked his mower and watched. Nobody wanted to miss it, because everybody in the neighborhood knew what had happened. And everybody knew Randall. For years, people had tolerated him. The lectures, the criticism, the constant need to be right. Now, they were witnessing something rare. A man running directly into a wall he had built himself. Around 11:30, the last major section came down. By noon, the shed was gone. Completely gone. All that remained was broken concrete and exposed dirt. The workers loaded the final materials onto the truck, collected their equipment, finished their paperwork, and left. Just like that. Months of planning. Thousands of dollars. Weeks of arrogance. Gone in a single morning. The street became quiet again. I stood there for a while looking at the empty space. Then my eyes drifted toward Randall. He was still standing in the same spot, arms crossed, staring at the ground. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked small. Not physically, emotionally, like reality had finally caught up with him. A few days later, the final bill arrived. Removal fees, transportation costs, administrative penalties, permit violations, storage charges. The total came out to just over $3,000. And that didn't include what he'd already spent building the shed in the first place. I heard the number from another neighbor who somehow always knew everything before everyone else. The final cost was significantly higher than Randall ever expected. The irony wasn't lost on anybody. He could have fixed the problem immediately. Instead, he paid several times more to avoid admitting he was wrong. But here's the thing people always expect when they hear a story like this. They expect me to tell you that I felt victorious, that I celebrated, that I sat on my porch enjoying every second of his embarrassment. The truth is more complicated, because once the shed was gone, I walked over to that corner of my yard and looked at the ground where my grandmother's hydrangea bush used to be. And that part still hurt. The roots were dead. The plant was gone. Nothing the county did could bring it back. No invoice could fix that. No legal victory could replace 10 years of memories attached to those flowers. For several weeks, I left the area untouched. Broken concrete fragments sat there. Fresh dirt remained exposed. Every time I looked at it, I thought about something. Not the shed, not Randall. The assumption, because that's really where this entire story started. The assumption that I wouldn't push back. The assumption that quiet people are weak. The assumption that kindness means surrender. I think a lot of us deal with that in one form or another. At work, in families, in friendships, in neighborhoods. Someone decides who they think you are. Then they start treating you according to that version instead of the real one. And if nobody challenges that assumption, it grows. Little by little, year after year, until one day they're standing in your yard pouring concrete over something that matters to you. The following spring, I finally cleaned up the area. I hauled away the remaining debris, brought in fresh soil, leveled the ground. Then I planted a new hydrangea bush in the exact same spot. Not because it replaced the old one. It didn't. Some things can't be replaced. But life moves forward whether we're ready or not. The new bush started small. A few leaves. A handful of blooms. Nothing impressive. Yet every time I watered it, I felt strangely at peace. Because that corner meant something different now. It wasn't just a memory of my grandmother. It was proof that some lines are worth defending. Not aggressively, not angrily, just clearly, firmly, without apology. As for Randall, we still live on the same street. We don't talk much. We nod occasionally. That's about it. And maybe that's for the best. Some stories don't end with friendship. Some stories end with understanding. He understands where the property line is now. And I understand something about myself that I didn't fully understand before. Being calm doesn't mean being weak. Being patient doesn't mean being passive. And avoiding unnecessary conflict doesn't mean surrendering when conflict finally becomes necessary. So now I'm curious what you think. Would you have handled it the same way? Would you have confronted him immediately the first day? Would you have called the county sooner? Or would you have tried to work it out face-to-face before involving anyone else? And here's the bigger question. At what point does being a good neighbor stop being kindness and start becoming permission? Let me know down in the comments, because I genuinely think reasonable people can disagree about that. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor, coworker, family member, or anyone who mistook your silence for weakness. I'd love to hear your story too. Sometimes the most important boundaries in life aren't the ones marked by survey stakes. They're the ones people assume you'll never defend.